On May 10, 2011, the North Carolina Humanities Council presented a lecture entitled "The Many Faces of Islam Beyond the Headlines," which was delivered by the University of North Carolina at Greensboro's Professor Omar Ali. This lecture was organized by the NC Humanity Council's Rhodes Scholars Program and was hosted by the North Regional Library in Raleigh, North Carolina. Dr. Omar Ali's expertise lies in Muslim and African American history. He's the author of In the Lion's Mouth, Black Populism in the New South, and In the Balance of Power. Dr. Ali provided a brief historical background of Islam and answered general community members' questions about Islam.
So Islam is, first of all, a monotheistic faith. Okay? That means that Muslims believe in a single God, Allah. It begins in the Arabian Peninsula. Year one of the Muslim calendar is 622, right? That's the year that basically Islam sees itself as beginning, right? Islam is a continuation, and this is very important to underscore because I think there's a lot of ignorance out there about this. Islam is a continuation of the Judeo-Christian tradition. One of the extraordinary things is that Islam will spread very, very quickly. It resonates among the poor. It resonates among the outsiders because what Islam is introducing is a reform of Arabian societies. It's calling for a radical egalitarianism, right? As it turns out, and this also comes as a surprise for a lot of folks, Muslims, women, actually had very progressive sort of rights in this period in time. They had the right to divorce, they had the right to hold property. They were much more active in civil and political society. That changed over time. That's not so much the fault of Islam itself, but of the societies that became increasingly, well, male-driven. It's a sexist world, and more guys got into power where they would say, this is what Islam really is, and women's voices and women's role became more and more marginalized. But you'll remember that Khadija, who was Muhammad's wife, was 15 years his elder. She was a very astute businesswoman. She had a whole bunch of guys working for her. And she becomes basically the first convert. Others will follow when they hear of this message, because Arabian society then, and continues to be, but then especially, was very tribally oriented. And so you basically were in one tribe, and then you couldn't talk to the people in this tribe or in this tribe. And so it was very, very sort of sectarian. And what Muhammad was saying, what he was understanding, was that there was actually a shared human society, a human community, if you will, what would be called the Ummah Wahida, the single Muslim community.
Dr. Ali also discussed the history of the spread of Islam and Muslim communities around the world, including in the Americas.
And so Islam spreads basically, by the year 711, it reaches the Iberian Peninsula, right over there, right? And also will reach the Hindu Kush, which is basically over here, where modern-day Pakistan bordering on India is, right over here. And so it spreads all the way this way and all the way that way within a relatively short period of time. Over the next couple of centuries, it will also go down the East African coast. I'm right now working on a book called Islam in the Indian Ocean World. It's a documentary source book looking at Islam in this Indian Ocean world. And what you see is that you have these merchants coming down here. Actually, these merchants have been coming down for some time. But these Persian and Arab merchants would fuse with local Bantu or African societies to create what's called the Swahili cultures. And so you have these Swahili cultures, which is mostly on the coast, becoming Muslim. A little later, you have Islam going across the Sahara, down the Sahara, and into the West African areas, spreading this way, and will also continue into India and then further Southeast Asia into Indonesia by the 11th century. So by the 12th century or so, Islam is very clearly a world religion. It's global in its scope. Well, we don't talk about the New World, but it's covering a very large swath of the Old World. Islam would also reach the New World very early on because many of the immigrants, forced migrants, were coming from West and Central West Africa, where there was a good deal of Islamic culture already sort of formed there. Sylviane Diouf, who's wrote a book called Servants of Allah, looks at Muslims in the Americas, and she estimates that out of the approximately 10.7 million Africans who were forcibly brought over as part of the transatlantic slave trade, about between 15 and 20% of them were Muslim. An interesting statistic is that up until 1820, upwards of 80% of the migrants from the Old World to the New World were Africans. So as it challenges our concept of, sort of, I think that most of us, when we went to school, saw the sort of the migrants from the Old World as primarily European white. But as it turns out, it was very black, the migrations that came mostly to, 40% to Brazil and then the Caribbean, and only a small percentage going directly to the United States. But many of these people, we're talking about probably around 2 million people, were Muslims. Now, because this world was predominantly Christian as opposed to Muslim in the Indian Ocean world, Islam was suppressed. And within a few generations, a lot of these Muslims had either converted on their own volition, or they just nominally did so, or did so as a matter of true faith to Christianity. But Islamic culture was part of the early colonial presence. So when people talk about migrants, Muslims being sort of a new migratory grouping of people to the Americas, it's actually not true.
For many people, the dominant image of Islam, especially after the tragic events of 9/11, is of intolerance and extremism. Dr. Ali provided his explanation of this aspect of Islam.
But as there was a progressive push within Islam in the early community, there was also a push to try to keep things the way they were. And that's where you see sort of these tensions, and they've been historic tensions. So you have the conservatives, right, and some would say the ultra-conservatives, like you look at the Taliban, right, versus the people who are reformists, who began to have a voice of their own in the late 19th century. A person like Syed Ahmad Khan in India becomes a person who says Islam needs to be reformed. It needs to come to speed with the modern world. And so there were efforts to try to bring in Western values with Islamic values together and sort of synthesize something new. And that's an ongoing fight.